The Vikings are enshrined in history as sea-roving barbarians, as immortalised in the words of Alcuin of York, when he recounted the Viking raids on the Isle of Lindisfarne in 793 CE. Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we now have suffered from a pagan race. But when you examine the traces of what the Vikings left behind, another picture emerges of a complex and vibrant society with its own distinctive culture and way of life. Join me as we dig into the layers of Viking society to try and unlock the everyday lives of these people, who history portrays far too simplistically. What did the Vikings look like? What kind of clothes did they wear? These are questions which can only partly be answered by written sources, which almost exclusively come from outsiders who encountered the Vikings. One of these people was Ibn Fadland, who recounts his experiences with Rus Vikings. He states that, "I saw the Rus, who had come for trade and camped by the river Itil. They wear neither coats nor caftans, but a garment which covers one side of the body and leaves one hand free. Each of them carries an axe, a sword, and a knife, and is never parted from any of the arms which we have mentioned." While this passage does give us some minor details, overall the information is lacking, so we can then turn to the archaeology to better build a picture of the Vikings. Some traces of fabric survive, which tell us that they primarily made their clothing out of linen, wool, or dyed using plant materials. Silk was a rarity which was only reserved for the elites, being used for trim and panelling. Fur was utilised, but not in the way that you would expect, because it was used for trimming, not for whole garments. Surviving figurines and statues indicate how these fabrics were utilised. The Vikings opted for tunics. 2 tunics were worn, an inner layer and an outer layer, to provide protection from the colder climates. The length of the tunic would have depended on the presentation of the wearer. More feminine styles, for example, would have opted for an ankle-length dress style, which usually was worn with an additional layer of an apron dress. Ibn Fadlan describes these, which were upheld by circular brooches, which beads sometimes would have been threaded between. Masculine styles of tunics would have instead been cut off below the knee. These would have been worn with trousers and leg wraps to insulate the legs. The cut and style of these garments would have differed depending on the geographical location of the wearer. For example, Rus Vikings, who settled on eastern trade routes such as the Volga, had a distinct style of trousers, which involved greater folds of fabric. This stood in contrast to the trousers of the Vikings of Scandinavia and the British Isles, who tended to wear closer fitting trousers. Belts were worn universally for utilitarian purposes. Accessories to keep out the cold were also universal, such as cloaks and mittens. Hats and head coverings were also worn, but again differed depending on geographical location or the presentation of the wearer. Some styles were popular with everyone, for example, such as this one, which is based on a reconstruction from Dublin. Leather boots would have also been worn by everyone, and incredibly some survive, such as this vast variety from Jorvik. Jewellery would have also been used for aesthetic purposes. Necklaces, rings, beads, and arm rings were all popular choices for the Vikings. Pendants were also worn typically also for magical and religious purposes. The Vikings took great pride in their appearances, which is highlighted in both the written sources and archaeology. Ibn Fadland again states that, "I have never seen bodies more perfect than theirs." Large amounts of hygiene tools have also survived, such as ear scoops. The Vikings tended to keep their hair and beards long. These would have been cared for using combs, which have been found in copious amounts, such as these which were found in Jorvik, which were made of antler. It highlights the great care that Vikings put into their appearance, which goes against the barbaric stereotype that they are often portrayed with. Viking homes in their basic form were similar for everybody, rectangular buildings known as longhouses. These served as multifunctional spaces for dining, cooking, sleeping, working, and recreational use. In some Viking farmsteads, there even was space to keep livestock in during colder weather. Materials used would have differed depending on what was available. On a timber frame, either out of wattle and daub or wooden planks, walls were built. Floors would have likely been made out of wooden planks or compressed earth. Roofs too would have been made out of thatch or wooden tiles. In places where wood was scarce, however, different materials would have been used. For example, in Iceland, where there was a lack of trees, longhouses would have been built out of turf and stone, like this reconstruction in West Iceland. Another thing that would have differed about these structures was their size, which ranged from 5 to 15 metres long. For the average family, the longhouse would have been made up out of a single room, with a central hearth for cooking, light and warmth. It was likely that an iron cooking pot was suspended over the fire to be used for preparing meals. A table likely would have been present too, for both eating and working. No space would have been wasted in these longhouses, because of the large number of people living in them. Furniture then would have been multi-purpose. Wooden benches would have served as seating in the day and then transformed into places to sleep at night. For the Viking elites, however, longhouses would have been grand buildings that dominated the landscape. The largest longhouse to date was the Borg longhouse, which was over 80 metres long. There would have been enough space for all the household, potentially with separate sleeping and living spaces. We know that this could have been the case because beds survive, for example in the Osberg ship burial. There also would have been larger fire pits in these elite longhouses, as well as other sources of light. It has been proposed that oil lamps were used, as found in the Osberg ship burial, or candles with holders found in the Gokstag ship burial. These longhouses would have further been decorated with bright colours or luxuries like tapestries. This one survives also from the Osberg ship. The Overhogdal tapestries from the late Viking Age are also a remarkable find. Interestingly, new evidence even suggests that some elite Viking longhouses could have had glass windows. The thing to remember is the longhouses of the Viking elite, they would have been constructed for a communal purpose. Thus, the main area of longhalls would have had enough space to fit the whole local community and guests when the need arose during feasting or other festivals. The atmosphere of a longhouse is captured here in Beowulf. Then the due time arrived for Halfdane's son to proceed to the hall. The king himself would sit down to feast. No group ever gathered in greater numbers, or better order around their ring-giver. The benches filled with famous men who fell to with relish. Round upon round of mead was passed. Inside Heorot there was nothing but friendship. Speaking of feasting, what did the Vikings eat on these occasions? What did they eat, more importantly, in their everyday lives? Of course, with everything with the Vikings, it depended on regionality. But for most societies, grain constituted the basis of what most people ate daily. Barley and oats were the predominant cereals that the Vikings ate, but wheat and rye were consumed too, depending on a settlement's climate and location. They were eaten in a variety of ways, for example added to pottage or made into porridge. The most popular way that grain was eaten was to be ground down into flour and baked into bread. There was a variety of different types of bread that were eaten, including loaves and a kind of flatbread that was made on a pan across the hearth. Grain also could be brewed into beer and ale. Water and milk were also drunk by the Vikings. Mead, which is usually associated with them, was usually drunk at feasts or by elites. As for protein, the image of the Vikings that we have is of them in a feasting hall, consuming large amounts of meat. The Vikings of course did eat meat, but who had regular access to it very much depended on class and climate. Evidence of meat consumption survives, with animal bones found across Viking settlements. The Vikings ate a wide range of animals: mutton, goat, beef, as well as hunted animals like elk and reindeer. The Vikings also consumed fowl like geese and ducks. Pork was especially favoured by the Vikings. Chickens could also have been consumed, but they were mainly kept for their eggs. This meat was eaten fresh, however, it was more common to preserve this meat through heavy salting or putting it in a sour whey substance to stop it from spoiling. Meat was also preserved through smoking. Being a seafaring people, the Vikings of course ate both freshwater and seawater fish and other seafood. Herring and cod were especially important for the Vikings, which were also preserved using similar means. Dairy provided another important source of protein for the Vikings, which they acquired from the milk of cows, sheep and goats. Vegetables were eaten too, including turnips, leeks, shallots, peas, beans, as well as fruits like apple, pears and wild berries. The food of the Vikings was certainly not bland and was flavoured with a range of goods. For sweetness, honey was used, with sugar being still unknown to this part of the world. A range of herbs were used depending on what was available. Mild garlic, dill, thyme and parsley. Spices also could have been used by the elites, who could afford to import them through southern trade routes. The Viking world was a place of localised power, with unified kingdoms only really a phenomenon in the later Viking period. Most people lived in rural environments, either in lone farmsteads or usually in village communities. However, a small percentage of people lived in urban centres, such as Birka, Hedeby and Ribe. This figure was ever growing throughout the Viking Age, especially with outwards expansion in non-Scandinavian urban centres, which developed large Viking populations, such as Dublin or York. At the top of Viking society was the elites, royals and jarls who had control over localised power. These people's lives were characterised by wealth, violence and dominion over resources, which was displayed through physical and material means, as discussed earlier, like feasting and clothing. The jarls would have led the local community in domination over areas of life, such as justice, religious rituals and warfare. Below the jarl in Viking society typically were the professional warrior class, who composed the herd, the houseguard of the jarl. They were bound to him through a reciprocal relationship. In return for a warrior's loyalty and service, jarls rewarded them with gifts of wealth, as characterised in this passage of Beowulf. We pledged loyalty to our lord in the hall, promised our ring-giver we would be worth our price, make good the gift of the war gear, those swords and helmets, and as when his need required it. Other people also held an important role in the local community, in tandem with the jarl's houseguard, including the law speakers, who took on the task of memorising and preserving Viking law customs. Skalds, bards, similarly took on the role of preserving and transmitting the stories and identity of the Viking people, whilst offering a form of entertainment in their music and poetry. Religious figures also had an important role in local communities, who acted as mediums to the magical fabric of the 9 realms. The next group that I want to discuss is the Carls, or the free people, who made up the majority of the population, and thus carried out the work which was necessary to the workings of Viking society, such as artisans and merchants. Most people in the agrarian nature of the early medieval period would have been farmers, who tended to their livestock and crops. Carls did have some power in society, being able, for example, to participate in the Thing, the assembly that took on legal, political and administrative significance. At the bottom of Viking society was the thrall, the class of slaves whom the wealth of Viking society rested upon. Somebody could find themselves enslaved in a variety of different ways. They could be born into slavery, be sold into slavery by themselves or their relatives to pay off a debt. Slavery was also a legal punishment in Viking society. Slaves were mostly acquired, however, when they were captured during raiding or otherwise trafficked through the slave trade routes. The role of slaves very much depended upon the personal context which they lived in. For example, some slaves were used as servants, rowers on ships, agricultural workers, or as concubines. What characterised the state of slavery in Viking society, as Stephen Brink argues, was a complete absence of legal capability and protections, since thralls were seen as the property of another, looked upon as a tool, a thing, not a human being. While the absence of legal protections did not in reality take away slaves' agency or personhood, there is no doubt that slavery warranted a bleak existence, as is highlighted through the various slave collars that survive, that remain a symbol of the grim commodification of people in the Viking world. In order to truly understand the everyday life of Vikings, it's important to examine the micro level of how society operated in local communities and in relationships. Overall, the Vikings seem to have had a household-based society, in which many generations of kin, grandparents, parents and children both lived and worked together, sometimes alongside additional workers, servants or slaves. Marital relations functioned in complex ways in Viking society, not adhering to modern ideas. Marriages often did not happen completely out of love, but were for practical, economic or strategic purposes, with men marrying off female relatives in order to make alliances or gain through the bride price. Furthermore, it seems that polygamy was sometimes practiced. This happened often through concubinage, meaning that Viking males could have had more than one partner, which added a layer of complexity to marital dynamics, the matters of inheritance, and most importantly the role of women. It does seem, however, that social practices were in place which had legal backing, which somewhat offered a level of security and power for Viking women, who were given a dowry and had the right to divorce their husbands, which gave Viking women a level of agency which other women in this period did not necessarily have access to. Throughout this video, we have explored the many faces of Viking life, from clothing and food to home and the structures of people who inhabited them. What emerges is a picture full of contradictions, a society which was permeated with violence but was rich in material culture, a society which allowed greater freedoms for groups such as women but was built off the labour of slaves, a society which was hierarchical in nature but was ever outward looking in its scope and connections. Hi there, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing. I also have an Instagram and a TikTok page which I have linked below. Again, thank you so much for watching. I have been Our Historia, and until next time.